The way you treat someone with nothing will tell me everything about who you really are. The wind cut sharply between the glass towers of downtown Chicago, carrying the smell of rain and exhaust as people rushed past in tailored coats and polished shoes, each step echoing against the concrete like a quiet race no one wanted to lose. And right at the base of a 40-story corporate building, where silver letters spelled out Coal Industries, a man sat on the curb wrapped in a worn gray hoodie, his shoulders slightly hunched, his hands loosely clasped as if conserving warmth. Though it wasn't the cold that made people avoid him. It was the way he didn't belong, the way his presence disrupted the perfect image everyone else tried so hard to maintain. And Chloe Bennett noticed him the moment she stepped out of her rideshare, her heels clicking against the sidewalk, sharp, confident, deliberate, a rhythm she had practiced for years like armor against the world she refused to fall back into. Her reflection briefly catching in the glass doors ahead, sleek black blazer, pressed skirt, hair tied back just right. Everything controlled, everything intentional. Because control meant safety, and safety meant never going back to the version of herself she had buried long ago. She adjusted the strap of her leather bag, took a breath, and moved forward, until the man shifted slightly in her path, not aggressively, not even fully standing, just enough to exist where she didn't want him to. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice steady, not desperate, just present, and that was enough to make her jaw tighten, because she knew that tone, the kind that asked for acknowledgment, not pity, and she didn't have time for either, not today, not ever again. "I don't carry cash," she replied quickly without stopping, her tone clipped, rehearsed, the kind of answer that usually ended conversations before they began. But he didn't move, didn't apologize, didn't shrink the way most would. Instead, he looked at her, really looked, calm, observant, and for a split second, something about that unsettled her more than it should have. So she stopped, exhaled sharply, and turned back just enough to face him fully. "Look," she said, lowering her voice but sharpening every word. "You can't just sit here in front of a building like this. People are trying to work." A couple of nearby employees slowed their steps, glancing over, curiosity flickering across their faces, and Chloe felt that familiar surge of pressure in her chest, the need to assert control, to not be seen as weak, to not be mistaken for someone who tolerated disorder. "You're making this place look bad," she added, crossing her arms now, her posture rigid, defensive, as if she were guarding more than just a doorway. The man didn't respond immediately, his eyes steady, unreadable, and then, almost gently, he reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a small, worn card, the edges slightly bent, the surface faded, and for a moment it caught the light in a way that made it look almost important. But Chloe didn't care enough to look closely. "Sometimes," he said, his voice calm, measured, the way a place looks depends on how people choose to see it. She let out a short, incredulous laugh, shaking her head as if dismissing something absurd. "Yeah. Well, I see someone who doesn't belong here," she replied, her words landing harder than she intended. But she didn't pull them back, couldn't, because pulling back meant doubt, and doubt meant weakness, and she had worked too hard to allow that. The building's revolving door spun behind her as a security guard stepped closer, already reading the situation. "Everything okay, ma'am?" he asked, and Chloe nodded quickly, gesturing toward the man without looking at him again. "He's blocking the entrance," she said. Simple, decisive, final. The guard hesitated for a fraction of a second, then turned toward the man, offering a polite but firm request to move along. And as the man slowly rose to his feet, brushing off his jeans with an almost deliberate calm, he glanced back at Chloe one last time, not angry, not embarrassed, just thoughtful, as if filing something away. "Have a good morning," he said quietly, and somehow that made her more uncomfortable than anything else. She didn't respond, just turned on her heel and walked into the building, her reflection swallowing her whole as the glass doors closed behind her, sealing her inside a world of polished floors, quiet elevators, and controlled environments where everything made sense, where people knew their place, where she knew hers, or at least that's what she told herself as she stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the 27th floor, her fingers lingering for just a second longer than necessary, because somewhere beneath the surface of her composure, something small and unwelcome, had started to shift, something she immediately pushed down, straightening her posture as the doors slid shut, unaware that the man she had just dismissed wasn't leaving. Not really. And that before the day was over, the version of herself she had so carefully constructed was about to be tested in a way she never saw coming. The elevator ride felt longer than usual, not because of the distance to the 27th floor, but because Chloe could still feel the weight of that man's gaze lingering somewhere in the back of her mind, steady and quiet, like a question she refused to answer. And as the doors slid open to the sleek, open-concept office of Cole Industries, the familiar hum of keyboards, low conversations, and distant phone calls wrapped around her like a shield, pulling her back into a world she understood. A world where performance mattered more than perception, and where every move she made brought her one step closer to the promotion she had been chasing for the past 2 years. "Morning, Chloe." A voice called from across the floor, and she turned slightly, offering a quick nod to Marcus from accounting without breaking stride, her heels clicking with purpose as she headed straight to her desk, placing her bag down carefully, aligning it with the edge as if even the smallest detail could influence how she was seen, how she was evaluated, how she was judged. Because here, everything counted. She powered on her computer, her reflection flickering briefly across the black screen before it came to life. Spreadsheets, emails, schedules, all waiting, all demanding, all predictable. And that predictability calmed her, steadied her, erased the faint discomfort that had followed her inside, at least for a moment, until her inbox refreshed and a new message appeared at the very top, flagged urgent, company-wide. The subject line simple but commanding: mandatory executive meeting, attendance required. Her brow tightened slightly as she clicked it open, scanning quickly all department leads and selected staff to report to the main boardroom at 10:30 sharp. No exceptions, no rescheduling. And below it, a second line, almost an afterthought: executive leadership will be present. She leaned back in her chair just slightly, her fingers tapping once against the desk as her mind began to calculate. Executive leadership meant visibility, and visibility meant opportunity, and opportunity meant she could finally prove she was more than just another mid-level employee trying to survive in a system designed to filter people out. Big meeting. Her coworker Jenna asked from the neighboring desk, leaning over just enough to peek at Chloe's screen, and Chloe nodded once, composed, already shifting into the version of herself she needed to be. "Looks like it," she replied, her voice calm, controlled. "Probably something about restructuring or expansion." Jenna made a face, half curious, half concerned. "As long as it does not mean more work for the same pay," she joked lightly. But Chloe did not laugh, because for her, more work was not a burden. It was leverage, it was proof, it was the only currency that had ever mattered in her life. "It means opportunity," Chloe said instead, her tone firm, almost automatic, and Jenna gave her a small, knowing smile before turning back to her own screen. The office noise rising and falling around them like a tide, steady, familiar, safe. But beneath it all, something else had begun to build, something quieter, more deliberate, unseen, and far above them, behind closed doors on the top executive floor. A man stood at the wide glass window overlooking the city, now, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his posture straight, his presence commanding in a way that required no announcement, no introduction. Ethan Cole adjusted the cuff of his sleeve with a calm precision, his expression unreadable as he glanced down at the tablet in his hand. Security footage paused on a single frame. Chloe standing outside the building, her arm crossed, her face sharp with judgment, the image still, but the moment alive in his memory, not because of what she had said, but because of how easily she had said it, without hesitation, without doubt, as if it were second nature. And that was what interested him. Not cruelty, but certainty, the kind of certainty that revealed a person's core more clearly than any performance ever could. He tapped the screen once, closing the footage, then turned toward the conference table behind him where a small group of senior executives sat waiting, their expressions expectant, cautious, respectful. "We are not just reviewing numbers today," Ethan said, his voice even, controlled, carrying effortlessly across the room. "We are reviewing people." A subtle shift moved through the room, attention sharpening, curiosity rising, but no one spoke. No one interrupted. Because when Ethan Cole decided to test something, the outcome was never random. It was intentional, precise, and always revealing. Back on the 27th floor, Chloe stood in front of the mirror in the restroom, adjusting her blazer, smoothing down a wrinkle that no one else would have noticed, her reflection staring back at her, composed, confident, unshaken. She reached for her lipstick, applying it with steady hands, then paused for just a fraction of a second, her eyes narrowing slightly as a fleeting image crossed her mind. The man outside. The way he had looked at her, not offended, not defensive, just aware. She exhaled quietly, shaking her head as if to dismiss the thought. Focus, she whispered to herself, placing the lipstick back into her bag. Because whatever that moment had been, it did not matter here. Not in this building, not in this life she had built piece by piece. Step by step, she straightened her shoulders, turned away from the mirror, and walked back toward the elevator, unaware that in less than an hour, she would be standing face to face with the same man again. Only this time, there would be no ignoring who he really was, and no escaping what that meant for her. By the time the clock on Chloe's laptop read 10:28, the entire energy of the 27th floor had shifted. Conversations grew quieter, movements more deliberate, and even the usual hum of printers and keyboards seemed to fall into a careful rhythm, as if the building itself understood that something important was about to happen. Chloe stood from her desk, smoothing down her blazer once more before stepping into the hallway where a steady stream of employees was already heading toward the main boardroom, her posture straight, her expression composed, every step measured like she was walking into a moment she had been preparing for her entire career, because this was how it started, she told herself. Visibility, recognition, advancement. The path upward was never announced. It was taken, earned, claimed, and she was ready, or at least she believed she was. The closer she got to the boardroom, the more the subtle tension in the air wrapped around her, low voices, quick glances, the quiet anticipation of something unknown. And when she stepped inside, she paused for just a fraction of a second, taking in the room. A long polished table stretching across the center, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the skyline beyond, rows of chairs already filling with department heads and senior staff. Everyone dressed sharp, focused, alert. She found a seat along the side, not too far from the front, but not at the center either, a strategic position, visible but not exposed. And as she sat, placing her notebook neatly in front of her, she scanned the room quickly, recognizing faces, measuring reactions, calculating dynamics the way she always did, because in rooms like this, information was not just spoken, it was read, interpreted, understood between the lines. Do you know what this is about? Someone whispered nearby, and another voice responded quietly. No idea. But when leadership calls everyone in like this, it is never small. Chloe kept her eyes forward, her expression neutral, but her mind was already working, possibilities stacking one over another, restructuring, expansion, leadership changes, each scenario carrying its own risks and opportunities, and she was ready to adapt to any of them, ready to position herself exactly where she needed to be. Minutes passed, the room slowly filling until nearly every seat was taken, the low murmur of voices rising and falling like a contained storm. And then, without announcement, the door at the far end of the room opened, the sound soft but enough to command attention. Conversation stopped almost instantly, heads turning in unison as a group of executives entered. First, followed by a figure walking just slightly behind them. Calm, unhurried, completely in control of the space without needing to demand it. Chloe's gaze shifted toward the door, her attention sharpening, her focus narrowing, and for a brief second, she did not recognize him, not because he looked different, but because her mind refused to connect the image in front of her with the memory she had pushed aside. The man now wore a perfectly tailored suit, dark, precise, every detail aligned. With the power he carried, his posture straight, his presence undeniable, and yet there was something familiar in the way he moved, something in the calm steadiness of his expression, something that did not fit neatly into the category her mind was trying to assign. He walked to the head of the table, the room completely silent now, every eye fixed on him, and as he turned slightly, placing a tablet down on the polished surface, Chloe felt it, That sudden, sharp shift in her chest, like a realization trying to break through before she could stop it, because now she could see it clearly, the same eyes, the same stillness, the same quiet awareness, the man from outside, the one she had dismissed without a second thought, the one she had told did not belong. Her breath caught, just for a moment, her fingers tightening slightly against the edge of her notebook as the truth settled in with a weight she could not ignore. He was not just another executive, not just another face in the hierarchy. He was the center of it. The reason the room existed the way it did, the reason everyone was sitting exactly where they were. Ethan Cole looked out across the room, his gaze moving slowly, deliberately, not scanning, but observing, as if he already knew what he would find. And when his eyes passed over Chloe, they did not linger, did not react. But something in that brief moment felt more direct than any confrontation could have been, because it was not recognition that unsettled her, it was the absence of surprise. The quiet certainty that he had known exactly who she was the moment she spoke to him that morning. "Good morning," he said finally, his voice calm, measured, carrying easily through the room without effort. And the simplicity of the words only made the tension stronger, because everyone in that room understood that this was not just a meeting. This was something else entirely, something that had already begun long before they took their seats. And Chloe sat there, perfectly still, her composure intact on the surface, but beneath it, something was unraveling. Because the moment she had dismissed outside was no longer gone, it was here, standing in front of her, fully revealed, and there was no version of control that could take it back. The silence in the boardroom did not break immediately after Ethan spoke. Instead, it settled deeper, heavier, as if every person in the room instinctively understood that whatever came next would not be routine. Chloe kept her gaze forward, her posture perfectly aligned, but inside, her thoughts moved faster than she could contain them, replaying every word she had said outside, every look, every assumption, each one now echoing with a clarity that felt sharper than before, because now it had context, now it had consequence. Ethan rested his hands lightly on the edge of the table, not dominating the space, but owning it completely, his presence steady, controlled. "Today is not about quarterly reports," he continued, his tone even, almost conversational, yet no one mistook it for casual. "It is about something far more important." A subtle shift moved through the room, shoulders straightening, attention sharpening. Chloe felt it too, that tightening in her chest, the quiet realization that this moment was not something she could prepare for, not something she could strategize her way through, because it was already unfolding, already decided in ways she did not yet fully understand. Ethan reached for the tablet in front of him, tapping the screen once, and without warning, the large display at the front of the room came to life, the image appearing instantly, clear, undeniable, and Chloe's breath caught before she could stop it. There she was, standing outside the building, her arms crossed, her expression sharp, the moment frozen but alive enough to feel real again, the angle unmistakable, the context impossible to deny. A faint murmur moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but enough to signal recognition, surprise, and something else, something closer to discomfort. Chloe's fingers pressed lightly against the table now, her composure still intact on the surface, but her pulse quickening beneath it, because this was no longer a possibility. It was happening, in front of everyone, without warning, without control. Ethan did not look at the screen, he did not need to. Instead, his gaze remained on the room, moving slowly, deliberately, as if measuring reactions rather than the image itself. "This morning," he said calmly, "I visited the front of this building." His words were simple, direct, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. "Not as your chief executive officer, but as someone else." He paused, just long enough for the meaning to settle, for the connection to become undeniable. Chloe felt it then, that moment where denial was no longer possible, where the truth stood fully formed in front of her, and there was no version of it she could reshape, no angle she could control. "I wanted to see something," Ethan continued, his tone unchanged, steady, measured, something that cannot be found in reports or performance reviews. The room remained completely silent now, no shifting, no whispers, just attention, focused and unbroken. I wanted to see how people behave when they believe no one important is watching. The words landed quietly, but their impact spread instantly, because everyone in that room understood exactly what he meant, and Chloe felt it more than anyone, because she had been there, she had spoken, she had acted without hesitation. Believing it did not matter, believing it would disappear the moment she walked through those doors. Ethan finally turned his head slightly, his gaze aligning with the screen for the first time, not lingering, just acknowledging it before returning to the room. What we tolerate, he said. What we dismiss, what we justify, those are the things that define us far more than any title ever could. Chloe's throat tightened slightly, not visibly, not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for her to feel it, that quiet pressure building, not from fear alone, but from something deeper, something more personal, because this was not just exposure, it was reflection, and reflection was harder to face than judgment. Ethan let the silence stretch for a moment longer before continuing. This company does not succeed because of numbers alone, he said. It succeeds because of people. And people are measured by how they treat those who have nothing to offer them in return. The words echoed in Chloe's mind instantly, pulling her back to the sidewalk, to the moment she had dismissed so easily, and for the first time, the certainty she had relied on began to shift, not breaking yet, but no longer as solid as it had been. Ethan's gaze moved across the room once more, steady, observant, and then, without raising his voice, without adding pressure, he asked a question that felt heavier than any accusation. So I want to know, he said, when you believe no one important is watching, who are you really? The room remained silent, but the question did not stay in the air. It settled into each person, forcing an answer whether spoken or not. And Chloe sat there, still, composed, her expression unchanged, but inside, the answer she had always believed in was no longer enough, because now, for the first time, she was not just being evaluated for her performance. She was being seen for who she was when it mattered most, and she did not know if that version of herself was someone she could defend. The silence that followed Ethan's question did not break. It deepened, stretching across the room like something invisible but undeniable, and for the first time since she had walked into the building that morning, Chloe felt something she could not immediately control, not panic, not fear, but exposure, the kind that did not come from being seen, but from being understood in a way she had never allowed before. Her fingers remained still against the edge of the table, her posture unchanged, her expression carefully neutral, but inside, her thoughts were no longer moving with the precision she depended on. Instead, they circled, repeating fragments of the same moment over and over. Again, the sidewalk, the man, the certainty in her voice, and now, the reflection of it displayed in front of everyone she worked with, everyone whose respect she had spent years trying to earn. This is not about punishment, Ethan continued after a moment, his voice calm, grounded, cutting cleanly through the tension without raising it further. It is about awareness. A few people shifted slightly in their seats. The subtle release of breath that came when something was clarified but not resolved. Chloe heard the words, but they did not settle easily, because awareness meant recognition, and recognition meant she could no longer pretend that what happened outside had been insignificant. Ethan stepped away from the head of the table, moving slowly along its length, not pacing, not imposing, just present, his hands loosely at his sides as his gaze moved from one face to another. Every person in this room has earned their position through effort, he said, through discipline, through results. His tone remained even, almost steady enough to feel reassuring. But none of that means anything if it is not matched by character. The word landed differently, quieter but heavier, and Chloe felt it settle somewhere deeper than the rest, because character was not something she had ever measured herself by. Not directly. She had measured success, progress, distance from where she started, distance from everything she refused to become again. Ethan stopped near the center of the table, his presence drawing focus without demanding it. The real test of leadership, he continued, is not how you perform when you are being evaluated. His eyes moved again, deliberate, observant. It is how you act when you believe there is nothing to gain. Chloe's chest tightened slightly, not visibly, but enough for her to notice, because that was exactly what had happened. There had been nothing to gain, no audience that mattered, no consequence she could see. And that was why she had not hesitated, why she had spoken the way she did, why she had believed it was justified, practical, necessary. And now, sitting in that room, she could not tell if that belief still held the same weight. Ethan reached the far end of the table and turned back toward the group, his expression unchanged, composed, controlled. "So I will ask again," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less clear, "when no one important is watching. Who are you really?" This time, the question did not feel like it was directed at the room. It felt focused, specific, and Chloe knew, without needing to look up, that it was meant for her. Not because he singled her out, not because he said her name, but because she was the one who already knew the answer. And for the first time, she was not sure if that answer was enough. Her gaze lowered slightly, just for a moment, her focus shifting to the edge of her notebook, where her reflection faintly blurred against the polished surface of the table. And in that reflection, she saw something she had not allowed herself to see before, not weakness, not failure, but a version of herself shaped entirely by fear. Fear of going back, fear of being overlooked, fear of not being enough unless she was always ahead, always in control, always separate from anything that reminded her of where she came from. And in that moment, she realized that the man outside had not threatened her. He had reflected something she did not want to recognize, something she had spent years trying to distance herself from. Ethan let the silence settle again, not forcing a response, not demanding one, because he did not need to. The question had already done its work. "We will continue this discussion," he said finally, stepping back toward the head of the table. "But first, I want each of you to consider that question carefully." His gaze moved across the room one last time, steady, composed, because the answer matters more than anything you will say here today. The screen at the front of the room dimmed slightly, the image fading, but the moment did not disappear with it. It remained, lingering in the space between people, in the quiet shift of posture, in the subtle tension that had replaced certainty. And Chloe sat there, still, composed, her outward appearance unchanged, but inside, something had shifted in a way she could not ignore, because for the first time, success alone did not feel like enough, and the version of herself she had relied on no longer felt as solid as it once had. The meeting did not end with applause or immediate discussion. It ended in something quieter, something heavier, as chairs shifted and people began to stand, not rushing, not speaking loudly, but carrying with them a weight that had not been there when they walked in. Chloe remained seated for a moment longer than most, her hands resting lightly on the table, her gaze fixed ahead even as the room slowly emptied around her. Conversations began in hushed tones, fragments of speculation and uncertainty drifting through the air, but none of it reached her fully, because her focus had turned inward in a way that felt unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. She stood finally, gathering her notebook without looking down at it, her movements precise, controlled, the same as always, but lacking the certainty that usually defined them. As she stepped out into the hallway, the noise of the office returned in waves, phones ringing, footsteps echoing, voices overlapping, but everything felt slightly different now, as if the environment had not changed, but her place within it had shifted just enough to make everything feel less stable. "Chloe," Jenna's voice called from behind her, catching up quickly, her expression curious, concerned. "What was that about?" Chloe paused briefly, turning just enough to face her, her expression composed, almost automatic. "A leadership evaluation," she replied, her tone even, neutral, the kind of answer that sounded complete without revealing anything. Jenna frowned slightly, glancing back toward the boardroom. "That felt personal," she said quietly, lowering her voice, like he already had something in mind. Chloe held her gaze for a moment, then gave a small, controlled nod. "Maybe he does," she said, before turning and continuing down the hallway, ending the conversation before it could go further, because there was nothing she could explain, not yet, not without confronting something she was not ready to say out loud. Back at her desk, she sat down slowly, her computer screen still open, emails waiting, tasks lined up exactly where she had left them. But for the first time in a long time, she did not reach for the keyboard immediately. Instead, she sat there, still, her eyes unfocused for just a moment as her thoughts replayed the morning again. Not the boardroom this time, but the sidewalk, the moment before everything changed, the way she had spoken, the certainty in her voice, the lack of hesitation, and now, seeing it from the outside, through someone else's perspective, it felt different. Not just justified, not just practical, but something else, something she had not wanted to name before. Her fingers tapped lightly against the desk once, twice, then stopped, because distraction would not work. Not this time. She pushed her chair back slightly, standing again, the movement small but decisive, and without giving herself time to reconsider, she walked toward the elevator, her steps steady but quieter now, less performative, more intentional. As the doors closed and the numbers began to descend, she exhaled slowly, her reflection staring back at her in the mirrored surface, composed, controlled, but no longer as certain as it had been that morning. The lobby was quieter than before, the midday rush already passed, the wide glass doors letting in a softer light as the sky shifted toward early afternoon. And as Chloe stepped outside, the city noise greeted her again, distant traffic, muted conversations, the constant movement of people who had somewhere to be. She hesitated just for a moment, her gaze scanning the area near the curb where the man had been sitting earlier, but the space was empty now, no trace of him, no sign that the moment had ever happened, and for a second, she felt something unexpected, not relief, not quite regret, but a sense of absence, like something unfinished. She took a few steps forward, her heels quieter against the pavement now, her attention drawn not to the building behind her, but to the space in front of her, the street, the people, the details she had ignored before, a man walking past with worn shoes, a woman sitting on a bench scrolling through her phone, a delivery driver adjusting a heavy box. Small moments, ordinary, but suddenly more visible, more present. She stopped near the edge of the sidewalk, her gaze lowering slightly, as if expecting to find something she had missed, something she could correct, but there was nothing there. No second chance waiting in the same place, no opportunity to undo what had already been done, and she realized then, quietly, that whatever came next would not be about fixing a single moment. It would be about something else entirely, something harder, something that required more than a simple apology. Behind her, the glass doors reflected her image again. But this time, she did not look at it, because for the first time, she was not focused on how she appeared. She was focused on who she had been, and who she might need to become, even if she did not yet know how to get there. The rest of the afternoon moved forward, but not in the way Chloe was used to. Tasks still appeared, emails still arrived, deadlines still existed, but none of them carried the same urgency they had just hours before, because something had shifted beneath the surface, something she could not push aside with efficiency or discipline. She sat at her desk, staring at a report she had already reviewed twice, her eyes scanning the numbers without absorbing them, her mind drifting back to the same question that refused to leave. Not Ethan's voice this time, but the meaning behind it, the version of herself she had revealed without realizing it, and the version she had always believed she was, the difference between them now impossible to ignore. She exhaled slowly, closing the document without saving any changes, because she knew she was not going to get anything done like this. Not until she addressed what had been left unresolved. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, then moved decisively, opening the internal directory, scrolling past names, departments, titles, until she found it. Executive Assistant, Office of the Chief Executive Officer. She hesitated for just a second, not out of fear, but because this was not something she could approach with the same calculated precision she applied to everything else. This was uncertain, unstructured, personal, and that made it harder than any presentation or negotiation she had ever handled. She clicked the contact, composing a short message, her words careful but direct, requesting a few minutes to speak. No explanation, no justification, just a request. She read it once, then again, then sent it before she could overthink it. The seconds that followed felt longer than they should have, her attention fixed on the screen as if waiting could somehow influence the outcome. And when the reply finally appeared, simple, efficient, for 15, top floor, she felt a small, unexpected shift in her chest. Not relief, not quite, but something close to it, Because now there was no more delaying, no more avoiding. The moment she had been circling was finally set. The clock moved slower after that, each minute stretching as she worked through what she could, forcing herself to complete small tasks, to maintain the appearance of normalcy, even if internally nothing felt normal anymore. And when for 15 finally arrived, she stood, smoothing down her blazer out of habit rather than necessity, her movements quieter now, less about impression and more about grounding herself in something familiar. The elevator ride up felt different from the one earlier, not filled with anticipation or strategy, but with something steadier, more focused, as if she had already accepted that whatever happened next would not be something she could control. The doors opened to a quieter floor, the kind of silence that came not from emptiness, but from precision, everything in its place, everything intentional. She stepped out, her heels softer against the polished floor, following the subtle signage toward the executive offices until she reached a wide, closed door, no nameplate needed. The space itself carried enough presence to identify who was behind it. She paused for a moment, not to reconsider, but to steady her breath, then raised her hand and knocked. The sound light, but clear. "Come in." Ethan's voice came from the other side. Calm, unchanged. She opened the door slowly, stepping inside. The office larger than she expected, but not excessive. Clean lines, minimal decoration, a wide desk. Near the windows, the city stretching out behind it. Ethan stood near the window, his back partially turned, his posture relaxed but deliberate, as if he had been expecting her, as if this moment had been part of a larger sequence he had already anticipated. He turned as she entered, his gaze meeting hers without surprise, without judgment, just steady, observant. "Chloe," he said simply, acknowledging her presence without adding anything more. And for the first time since that morning, she felt the full weight of the situation settle clearly, not through the reactions of others, not through the display in the boardroom, but through the quiet reality of standing in front of him, knowing exactly what had happened and what it meant. She stepped forward slightly, stopping at a respectful distance, her posture straight, her expression composed, but not guarded in the same way it had been before, because this was not a performance, not something she could navigate with confidence alone. "I asked for this meeting," she said, her voice steady, controlled, but softer than it had been earlier, less defensive, more direct, "because I need to say something." Ethan did not interrupt, did not move to sit. He simply watched, giving her the space to continue. And for a brief moment, she realized that this, more than anything, was what made it difficult. Not pressure, not authority, but the absence of both. The expectation that whatever she said next would be entirely her own, without influence, without direction, and for the first time, she allowed herself to pause, not to calculate, not to adjust, but to consider what she actually needed to say, because this was not about fixing an impression. It was about confronting something she had only just begun to understand, and she knew that whatever came next would define more than just this moment. It would define who she chose to be moving forward. Chloe drew in a slow breath, her fingers relaxing slightly at her sides as she met Ethan's gaze without looking away this time, not because she felt confident, but because she knew avoiding it would only confirm what had already been revealed. "This morning," she began, her voice steady but quieter than usual. "The way I spoke to you, there is no excuse for it." The words came out without hesitation, not rehearsed, not softened, just direct, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold that honesty in place. She continued before doubt could interrupt. "I told myself it was practical, that I was protecting the image of the company, that it was necessary." She paused briefly, her eyes lowering just slightly as she acknowledged the truth she had only recently begun to understand. But it was not any of those things. She lifted her gaze again, more grounded now, less defensive. "It was me choosing distance over empathy, control over understanding." Ethan remained still, his expression unchanged, but his attention fully present, not interrupting, not correcting, simply allowing her to continue. And that silence, that space, made it impossible for her to hide behind anything else. "I have spent a long time building a version of myself that does not look back," she said, her voice softening just slightly, not fragile, but real. "And somewhere along the way, I started believing that anything that reminded me of where I came from was something I had to reject. The admission settled in the room quietly, not dramatic, not forced, but clear enough to carry its own weight. She exhaled slowly, as if releasing something she had held onto for years without realizing it. So when I saw you out there, I did not see a person, she said, the words more difficult now, but no less steady. I saw something I was afraid of becoming again. Ethan's gaze shifted almost imperceptibly, not in judgment, but in recognition, as if the answer she had reached was the one he had been waiting for, not because it justified anything, but because it revealed something deeper than the action itself. Chloe straightened slightly, not out of defense, but out of clarity. That does not make it right, she added, firm now, grounded in what she was saying rather than how it might be received. It just explains why I did it. She paused again, the silence no longer uncomfortable, but necessary. And I am not asking you to ignore it, she continued. I am not asking for it to be overlooked or excused. Her hands remained still, her posture open. I am asking for the chance to prove that it is not who I want to be. The words landed without embellishment, without expectation, just a statement of intent. And for the first time since she had entered the room, she did not feel the need to control what came next, because whatever response followed would not change what she had just acknowledged. Ethan remained quiet for a moment longer, his gaze steady, thoughtful, as if weighing not her words, but the space behind them, the difference between performance and truth. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, unchanged in tone, but carrying something more deliberate now. Do you know why I did this? He asked, not as a challenge, but as a continuation of the conversation. Chloe shook her head slightly, her expression attentive, open. Not to expose people, he said, and not to embarrass anyone. He stepped away from the window, moving closer, not imposing, just closing the distance enough to shift the dynamic from distant authority to direct conversation. I did it because behavior is most honest when there is nothing to gain, he continued. And what I saw this morning was not a mistake. Chloe held his gaze, her expression steady, not resisting the truth of it. It was a pattern, he added, not harshly, not accusing, just factual. But patterns can change. The words did not come with reassurance, but with possibility, and that made them more meaningful than any immediate judgment could have been. Chloe nodded once, not quickly, not out of relief, but with understanding, because she knew that what he was offering was not forgiveness, it was responsibility. Then I will change it, she said simply, not as a promise meant to impress, but as a decision she had already begun to make. Ethan studied her for a moment longer, his expression unreadable but not distant, as if measuring something beyond her words, something in the way she held herself now compared to how she had stood that morning. And then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not approval, not dismissal, just acknowledgment. We will see, he said, his tone even, grounded. And Chloe accepted that answer without resistance, because she understood now that what mattered was not what he believed in this moment, but what she would prove over time. She stepped back slightly, her posture still composed, but no longer guarded. Thank you for hearing me, she said, her voice steady. And for the first time that day, there was no tension behind the words, just clarity. She turned toward the door, her movements calm, deliberate, and as she reached for the handle, she paused for just a fraction of a second, not to hesitate, but to recognize the shift that had taken place. Because when she walked out of that office, she would not be returning to the same version of herself that had walked in. She would be starting from something else entirely, something less certain, but more honest. And as she stepped back into the quiet hallway, she realized that for the first time, she was not focused on how far she had come, but on who she was becoming. The next few weeks did not come with a dramatic announcement or a visible transformation. There was no moment where everything suddenly changed and everyone noticed. Instead, the shift was quieter, almost invisible at first, but consistent in a way that made it impossible to ignore over time. Chloe returned to her desk the morning after her conversation with Ethan with the same responsibilities, the same expectations, the same environment she had navigated for years, but something in her approach had changed, not in a way that was forced or performative, but in small, deliberate choices that began to shape something new. She greeted people she would normally pass without acknowledgement, not out of obligation. But because she realized how easily she had dismissed others before, she listened more carefully in meetings, not just for information, but for understanding, and when situations arose that required quick decisions, she paused, even briefly, to consider not just the outcome, but the impact, and those pauses, though small, began to define her more than any immediate reaction ever had. Her coworkers noticed the difference, not all at once, not in a way that could be clearly explained, but in subtle observations. Jenna watched as Chloe stayed late one evening to help a junior employee revise a presentation, something she would have previously considered unnecessary. Marcus saw her step in during a tense discussion to redirect the conversation rather than dominate it, and slowly, the perception of her shifted, not from competence to something else, but from distance to presence, from control to awareness. And Chloe felt it too, not as validation, but as alignment, as if for the first time, the person she presented to the world was beginning to match the person she wanted to be. One afternoon, as she stepped out of the building again, the same sidewalk stretched out in front of her, the same city noise, the same movement. But this time, she did not walk past it without noticing. Her gaze moved more intentionally, taking in the details she had overlooked before, and then she saw him, not in the exact same place, not in the same posture, but close enough to recognize. Immediately, the man from that morning, Ethan, though this time he was not dressed in a suit, not in a way that marked his status, just present again, observing. And for a moment, Chloe hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, because this was not a test she could pass with a single action. It was something deeper than that. She stepped forward, her pace steady, her posture calm, and when she reached him, she stopped, not above him, not at a distance, but level, her voice quiet, but clear. "Good afternoon," she said, simple, direct, without expectation. Ethan looked up, his expression neutral at first, then shifting slightly as he recognized her, not surprised, not guarded, just attentive. "Good afternoon, Chloe," he replied, his tone even, the same calm presence she had come to understand. There was no immediate tension between them, no unspoken weight pressing the moment into something it did not need to be, just a quiet acknowledgement of where they stood now compared to where they had been. "I meant what I said," she continued, her voice steady, not defensive, not rehearsed, "and I am working on it." Ethan studied her for a moment, not searching for flaws, not expecting perfection, just observing the difference in how she carried herself, the absence of that sharp certainty, replaced by something more grounded, more considered, and after a brief pause, he nodded once, not in approval, but in recognition. "I can see that," he said, his tone unchanged, but the words carrying more weight than they would have before. Chloe allowed herself a small, almost unnoticeable breath, not relief, but acceptance, because she understood now that this was not about earning immediate trust. It was about building it consistently, through actions that did not require recognition, through choices that did not depend on who was watching. The city moved around them, people passing, cars slowing, conversations blending into the background, but the moment itself remained steady, grounded in its simplicity. "That is all I needed to say," she added, her voice calm, and Ethan nodded again, just once. "Then keep going," he replied, not as instruction, but as acknowledgement of the path she had chosen. Chloe gave a small nod in return, then stepped back, turning to continue down the sidewalk, her steps steady, not hurried, not performative, just intentional. And as she walked away, she did not look back, not because she was avoiding anything, but because she no longer needed to measure herself against that moment. She was no longer trying to prove who she was in a single interaction. She was becoming it, one decision at a time, and somewhere behind her, Ethan remained where he was, watching not as someone testing, but as someone observing change unfold in real time, knowing that the most meaningful transformations were never immediate, never obvious, but always consistent. And for the first time, Chloe's journey was not about climbing higher. It was about becoming better, not for recognition, not for approval, but because she finally understood that who she was when no one important was watching was the only thing that truly mattered.